In the final part of this module, I'm going to show you how we can use a class library from our application. The C# and .NET ecosystem are vast. They have been around for a long time, and that means that a lot of great minds have already written a lot of code that can be reused to accomplish certain tasks. The .NET base class library is itself a huge collection of classes that we can use, and we've done that basically right from the start of this course, even when our application had just one line, console.writeLine. We were already using a class part of the .NET class library. Using a class will often require bringing in the namespace that the class lives in, using a using statement. And we can of course also reference or use code written in some other project or library. Maybe your company has written a library with common calculations. Say for example that another team at Bethany SpyShop has created the wage calculation class, and that logic we can reuse in our application. No need to reinvent the wheel in that case, far from it. We could of course copy that code into our application, but a much better way would be that we reference the code. The external code will typically be packaged in a library. We can reference that library in our application, and once that is done, that code becomes usable from our application. So instead of writing everything from scratch, we can tap into the vast amount of already created libraries. How cool is that? In the final demo of this module, we are going to learn how we can use a class library in our application that is part of an external library that we will reference in our application. In the final demo of this module, we are going to use logic, perhaps written by a different team at Bethany SpyShop. They created a class library, so a library without a UI, so not a console application even, but just logic, a DLL. That's in fact an assembly. It contains compiled code. And they created that assembly and they made it available to us. And you can see it here. You can also get access to it. It is in the assets folder of the M9 folder, so the module 9 folder. That contains logic that we are going to be using in our application. Now what we're going to do is similar to what we already did with the NuGet packages, but now I'm going to use a library, so a DLL. How do we now use that logic, that class library in our code? Let's start by copying the path here. I'm going to right click on my project and say add project reference. We're going to create a reference to a local DLL, in this case a local assembly. And then we need to click on browse, and once again on browse. And then I need to navigate to the path that my DLL lives in. That is this DLL. Then we click on add and on OK, making sure that this DLL is checked. And this will add under dependencies an extra node here under assemblies, Bethany SpyShop hrm.logic. We can in fact double click it, and that should open the object browser we already saw. And that shows the Bethany SpyShop hrm.logic namespace, which contains the wage calculations class, and it contains a constructor and the complex wage calculation method. That's a method that is probably documented by the other team, and it requires 2 doubles and 2 integer values. Assume that this is the logic that we are going to be using in our application written by another team. So let's go back to our employee, and let us now do another calculate wage method. We already saw that the class was called wage calculations. So I'm going to bring in an instance of the wage calculations. By default, Visual Studio won't find it, but since we have already referenced that assembly, it will probably find it, and we can just bring in a using statement. And we can instantiate an object of that calculations class. Then we can create a double, which is going to be the result of on the wage calculations object that we just created, invoking the complex wage calculation. That requires a few arguments: the wage, the tax rate, the country ID, and the age. And assume that that then does all the complex calculations for us. So we're going to pass in the wage, the tax rate, country ID, let's put it to 3, and let's set the age to 42. And finally we can return the calculated value. I actually seem to have made a typo. I wanted to have calculated value. If I want to rename this everywhere where I'm using this, I can do Ctrl+RR. And then I can just change the value to calculated value, hit apply, and that will rename my variable everywhere where it's being used. See, by making a typo, we actually learned something new. All right. With this in place, we can now go back to program. And now here we can, on Bethany, call the calculate wage method, which then calls in turn the complex wage calculation method. This is how we can work with an external class library.